After 4 years of US conflict with NATO, the new president is looking to rebuild ties with Europe and strengthen the Transatlantic alliance. But did Donald Trump actually damage NATO with his suggestions that he could take the US out? Or did his belligerence leave Europe actually a safer place? This is Roundtable. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Well, Donald Trump certainly did get the allies to pay more for mutual defense. Now, Joe Biden says we're partners again, and the war in Europe is over. Former US President Trump's years in power arguably damaged the USA's transatlantic ties within NATO. But in his recent address to the Munich Security Conference, President Biden reaffirmed the US's commitment to its allies.
America is back. The Transatlantic Alliance is back. And we are not looking backward. We are looking forward together.
The US president knows that America's commitment to NATO was questioned under his predecessor. Now, many in Europe believe that Russia and China gained strategic advantages during Trump's years in office. So what will the Biden era really mean for Europe and the NATO military alliance? Well, I'm very glad to say we can welcome for the first time to this edition of Roundtable Dr. Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. We head to Singapore and we welcome back Rafaello Pantucci from the Royal United Services Institute, and once again allowing us to interview him from the United States, New Orleans to be exact, Dr. Tom Sutton, Professor of Political Science at Baldwin Wallace University. Great to have you all on the program. Jamie Shea, 38 years at NATO. You've seen it evolve. How vital do you think it is in this day and age to have a very strong North Atlantic Treaty Organization with America at its heart?
Well, it's absolutely vital because NATO is the United States, and without the United States, simply there's no NATO. So it was really heartening to hear President Biden at the Munich Security Conference last Friday recommit to NATO, recommit the United States unconditionally to the collective security clause of NATO, the Article 5, rescind Trump's decision to pull 12,000 troops out of Germany, and basically say that he wants to work with NATO and not impose unilateral decisions on the alliance, but in places like Afghanistan, analyse and decide together. So it's very good news for NATO, all the more so when you recognise that the European Union, although it represents the bulk of NATO members, 22 out of the 30, spends only 20% of what the United States and the other non-EU members like the UK spend on NATO's defence. So, the EU can't do this alone. Without the United States, it really would not be able to fulfil its core task. So, for the time being, really good news on the transatlantic defence front.
Okay, Article 5, the one to which you refer, I think is the one whereby if one member state is attacked, the others have promised to take action about it, which we've seen on a couple of occasions. It hasn't necessarily been followed through. We'll talk about the effectiveness of NATO as we go on. Rafaello, let me ask you about the last 4 years. Was Europe rather worried about what Trump was doing?
I think the concern in Europe was that you'd seen over the past 4 years that President Trump had raised issues that frankly were not new. I mean, American presidents and American administrations have long been frustrated by the lack of spending and seeming commitment to defense that you get from European capitals. So the complaints that he made about NATO members in Europe in particular should be spending more on their defense was not new in itself. I think the way it was articulated was different. I think the fact that he articulated it more as a kind of a rent-seeking duty that these members were failing to fulfill to the United States, rather than an articulation of their commitment to joint defense, I think was what really concerned people. It suggested that this alliance was no longer founded solely on the sort of Article 5 treaty, which says we're all going to fight for each other if one of us comes under attack, But instead, it suggested that this was some sort of transactional relationship based solely on the premised solely on the basis of us all spending a certain amount of money, which was mostly being spent on United States weapons, and this would somehow achieve collective security. So I think the phrasing and the tone that President Trump used over the past few years, I think was quite shocking to Europeans and suggested that the transatlantic alliance was no longer maybe as inviolable as they thought.
Let's listen to what the French President Emmanuel Macron had to say at this security conference.
When you look at the burden sharing within NATO, a large part of the investment, a large part of the commitments were made by the US. This is why, as Chancellor Merkel fairly said, we have to increase our defense investments. We will reach in the coming months the 2% of our GDP in defense expenditures. And I think this is very important because this is the way to rebalance the transatlantic relation.
So if we have President Macron there saying, yes, we will put our 2% into NATO, to some extent, Rafael, I suppose President Trump has helped the organization.
I mean, one could make the case that, President Trump's noise has clearly had the effect that was required to get member states to actually spend the money. I suppose the way that I suspect most Europeans would phrase it instead would be rather to say this was an intention they always had all along. And in some ways, this is an offer to President Biden to show him and his administration they are truly committed to collective defense and recognize that there has been a failing over the past few years.
So what would it mean to Donald Trump, Tom, if we can come to you, to understand that perhaps his actions, which were disparaging of the military alliance, may well have actually made it a bit stronger and a bit more financially sound?
Well, you can certainly make the case that what may have been a sense of being taken for granted was disrupted by Trump's approach. I think the other issue is what was the purpose of NATO and what is the purpose of NATO now? And the United States, as was mentioned before, has a history of moving into situations where it becomes a large international player and then sometimes moving back. In the last several years of the post-Cold War period, there were questions raised about, well, is there still a need for NATO? Now, certainly the case was made that there was. NATO was involved with Afghanistan, with Iraq, et cetera. But really, what is that mission moving forward? I think Russia has made it clear that it continues to be a threat and that NATO is needed for that. There's also the situation with Turkey, a NATO member, but what it's doing in North Africa and the Middle East. And so really what President Biden's doing is trying to make the case for this alliance is still vital to U.S. interests, and that those U.S. interests are the interests of 2021, not the interests of the 1970s and 80s.
Jamie, what do you think? Has NATO been shaken out of some sense of complacency by what we've seen over the last 4 years?
Well, indeed. I mean, life is complicated, as you well know. It's never black and white. And I agree that although President Trump's rhetoric often sounded anti-NATO and unsettled many of the allies, I agree with the point that was made that on burden sharing, Trump certainly got better results, even with his brutal shock therapy than his predecessors did in getting the Europeans to meet their commitments. And don't forget, those commitments were not imposed by Trump. They came from the Obama administration, where Joe Biden was, of course, the vice president. And I think the challenge for Biden, of course, even with softer language, is going to be to keep the Europeans' feet to the fire when it comes to those defense commitments. And the second thing, as I would say about Trump, is that his bark was worse than his bite, in the sense that he also deployed extra US forces to Poland, to Romania, up to NATO's missile defense systems in Europe, sent American strategic bombers and aircraft carriers over on NATO exercises. So what Trump actually did was in somewhat of a paradoxical contradiction to often what he said. And I think the challenge for Biden is going to be, as I say, to move those Europeans, particularly towards taking on a much greater responsibility for their defense. But not just in places like Africa, which Emmanuel Macron mentioned in his talk to the Munich Security Conference, but also in the hotspots of Eastern Europe, where the Americans, I think, would be looking for the Europeans in the Baltic states, in Northern Europe, in the Arctic area, to take on more responsibility as well. So I don't think the agenda will change. The question is will softer Biden language produce more results than Trumpian shock therapy? Let
me ask Tom Sutton about this, because Biden's been involved in US politics for a very long time, I think 30 years in the Senate. He will have shared some Americans' frustration, perhaps, at the belief that Europe wasn't necessarily pulling its weight when it comes to funding NATO. Is his approach going to be very different?
I think his approach will certainly be very different from what we saw with Trump. It's not going to be a confrontational approach, but I think he will continue to try to hold Europe accountable for what it needs to spend. At the same time, I think he recognizes that when a crisis erupts, we can't be talking about dollars and cents. And increasingly, the world continues to present us with crises that require a fairly rapid response. There was mention of Macron earlier and some of what he's been trying to talk about related to creating an all-European force that might even diminish or eliminate the U.S. presence. I don't know if that's necessarily going to go anywhere, but I think that's also a siren call to the Biden administration to say, we need to step up and strengthen this alliance to head off any effort by Macron or anyone else, and Turkey also comes to mind, that might want to break from NATO or recreate it in a way that leaves the U.S. diminished and really would very much hurt U.S. interests.
Rafaello, let me ask you, and this is for each one of you, so have a think while I'm putting the question. What do you think the biggest threats in the world through NATO's eyes are right now?
I mean, sitting in NATO, I think the preeminent concern for most member states is probably Russia. It's a power that sits right on the NATO's borders in Europe, and it's a power that continues to cause issues within European member states, continues to meddle, continues to cause problems, and continues to pose a real sort of threat. But I think there's a bigger issue, which I think is looming over the entire conversation, which is clearly present within President Biden's speech, and I think has been present in the strategic discourse in Europe and the transatlantic area for some time now, which is China, and how exactly to confront China. But I think the difference is that China is an issue which is outside of the kind of traditional NATO space and NATO thinking. And I think there's still some questions about whether this is really something that NATO is going to be able to confront, because I think within NATO, you've got member states, in particular the ones that are in Central Eastern Europe, who are far more agitated about Russia than they are about China. And so within the institution, you'll always have this kind of tension, which, you know, on the one hand sees Russia as the kind of more immediate and imminent threat. But I think increasingly you're seeing in the big capitals a growing sense of concern and worry about what exactly to do about China. And so I think that tension is going to be one that NATO is going to have to manage going forwards over the next few years. And then I think the final point I'd add on this is, of course, it's always important to remember that NATO is still involved in a war in Afghanistan. And I think this is often forgotten. And I think this is a shame, because I think this would be a place where I think it would really be wonderful if NATO was able to follow through and ensure that it did carry forwards on its first forward operational deployment mission abroad in Afghanistan, and ensure that this came to some sort of resolution that was what all member states wanted.
Jamie, do you want to follow up on that? What do you think the biggest threats are?
Although very much along the same lines as Rafael, but I think NATO's got 4 challenges. And as Rafael said, I think the first challenge is to distribute its time, its energy, its assets between containing Russia and dealing with China. I think most Europeans would accept the notion that they have to focus more on China if it's an issue of dealing with China in Europe. For example, you know, Chinese penetration of European businesses, the supply chain issues, you know, avoiding dependencies, the one belt, one road type of stuff. If it means that Europeans have to start sending frigates and armed forces to the Asia Pacific as part of a US containment strategy there, then I think it's going to be much more difficult and more controversial for the Europeans, who don't, in many cases, have the kind of capabilities to make themselves relevant players. So I think how NATO defines, you know, exactly what it intends to do vis-a-vis China, and not just talk about China, is going to be key. I think coming back to Russia, NATO has to develop an arms control agenda with Russia, because the way we got ourselves out of trouble with the Soviet Union before was not just having troops in Eastern Europe, it was negotiating, you know, nuclear arms control treaties, negotiating limits on tanks and all that kind of stuff that gradually dismantled the confrontation. And I think NATO has to get back seriously into that arms control business. I think a third thing is going to be the South, and I agree with Rafael, NATO can't extract itself entirely from the South. The French are worried about terrorism from Africa, and indeed NATO last week, when the defense ministers met, actually actually agreed to greatly increase its presence in Iraq. So although there's talk about drawing down in Afghanistan, NATO is taking over from many of the US security missions in Iraq. So it's certainly not disengaging from the Middle East. But finally, I think one of the key issues is we've seen over the last couple of months with climate change, with pandemics, with terrorism at home, the military becoming much more involved in the resilience within our societies. You see the soldiers more on the streets of Paris these days than you do on the streets of Kabul. And again, a balance between how NATO uses its military forces for defending the homeland against all of these different resilience tests. Like the pandemic, where soldiers have been building hospitals and delivering vaccines, and how NATO uses its troops in a more classical way to defend borders. So to my mind, those are going to be the four big issues.
I'll come back to you in a little while, Jamie, and you, Rafaello, to talk about how threats have changed over the course of the last two generations and what NATO needs to keep its eyes on. But Thomas, I wanted to ask you, China's been mentioned a couple of times there, and I wonder what the Biden administration will make of the fact that there is the US at the heart of NATO, and there is the European Union signing a trade deal with China, getting closer to China, when in fact the United States might be wanting to say, don't do that. Is that going to be a cause for friction?
Well, I think it's certainly going to be a balancing act. And what was referenced before related to China is that we have a somewhat unique situation where we have, on the one hand, a growing security threat in the South China Sea that with China exerting its military strength and its sphere of influence, the question of Taiwan, the question of those coastal waters, and the United States allies, and to a degree allies of European powers, such as Japan, Korea, Southeast Asian countries, etc. So on the one hand, there's that very conventional security threat, but on the other hand, there is this growing integration of the Chinese economy as the second largest economy with the rest of the world, and much more so with European Union countries and Britain than with the United States because of the last 4 years of Trump's policies. I think the Biden administration is going to try to rebuild policies that benefit the United States economy and by extension that of Europe, while at the same time paying close attention to the security threats that are represented by not just economic issues such as tariffs and dumping of products and that sort of thing, but very much the issue of cybersecurity. I think that's going to be first and foremost, and we'll probably see more of a continuation of policies from the Trump administration into the Biden administration related to the question of Huawei and the expansion of 5G networks, et cetera, because clearly China is doing what it's done for years, which is to take whatever steps are necessary to grab technology, perfect it, use it, and then gain from it financially, which often hurts American businesses and European businesses as well.
Jamie, does NATO get that it needs to be looking at different areas when it comes to different types of attacks?
Absolutely. I think what you see in NATO today is sort of two levels. First of all, focusing on threats as state actors, the Soviet Union, the challenge of China, the Iranian ballistic missile threat, threats that come with recognizable state flags on them. But of course, as Tom was rightly saying, what we've had over the last 20 years is all of these transnational threats, the threats that don't have flags, the anonymous people behind the cyber attacks, the impact of pandemics, or climate change, which are not man-made, or at least not directly. And what you see with NATO is an attempt sort of simultaneously both to deal with the sort of the nation-state actors through diplomacy, through deterrence, but also increasingly to step up its role in dealing with these transnational threats. When I was at NATO, we did an enormous amount on cyber, making NATO more resilient in that area. You see NATO now trying to make itself more resilient against fake news and disinformation operations. The Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has been calling now for NATO to step up in terms of dealing with climate change as well. So you've got a NATO which is much more multifaceted than your grandfather's NATO that I started working for during the Cold War. And so what NATO has to do, of course, in all of this effort is to have a clear sense of priorities and keep its focus and not chase too many horses in the circus at the same time.
Rafaello, if China has become one of the main threats in the world, did it benefit from the disunity that Donald Trump sowed among NATO members? And if that is the case, what does Biden have to do to get back the initiative?
Well, I think there's no doubt that I think President Trump's divisive approach to international affairs in NATO, but in pretty much every other institution that the United States has represented, marks a real boon to China. I mean, it forced people to make choices that they didn't really want to make. They hedged as a result, and the net result was a kind of vacuum that, frankly, China rushed in to fill. So I think there's no doubt that I think the approach that President Trump took, on the one hand, it did certainly sharpen things with China and the United States, and I think forced some thinking which people hadn't been eager to do, forced it up to the top of the agenda. And that, I don't think it's a bad thing in some ways. There were some realities that people were sort of ignoring, and now people are confronting. So that is positive. And I'm referring there to some of the human rights abuse, some of the human rights questions around Xinjiang, around Hong Kong, around other issues, questions that had sort of been bubbling along for a long time, but no one had really sort of focused on. And so to some degree, the sort of bright light that President Trump shone did help that. But I think in international relations terms, his approach of essentially, attacking like a bull in a china shop and sort of pushing forwards in this very aggressive way and going to every partner and saying, well, you have to choose now, you have to choose them or us. And if you don't, well, there's going to be consequences. This forced countries that frankly didn't really want to make choices. And I think it caused a lot of ructions and problems in international affairs. If I could touch one broader thing around NATO in particular within this context, which I think is a real opportunity missed, is that, NATO has a lot of experience in what you could call the Eurasian heartland. NATO has for a long time involved in training and working with Central Asian, with Caucasian forces now in Iraq. It's had a long-term deployment in Afghanistan. These are countries which sit on China's borders. And so in some ways, I think there's a real opportunity missed here for NATO, which has a lot of experience in the Eurasian heartland that sits next to China, which is an area where China is doing a lot of work and eager to invest and is playing an ever more substantial role. And it's a place where I think NATO could make an interesting difference. I think to go back to Jamie's point about NATO member states struggling maybe to deploy the maritime assets required to sort of meet up with American requirements in the South China Sea, I think is spot on. But where I think these member states can make a real difference is in the Eurasian heartland, where they already have a lot of history and already have a lot of connections. And so I think when NATO is looking out towards China, if it really wanted to focus on where its value add could be, I think thinking about the role that it's played for a long time in the Eurasian heartland and how this matches up with what China's been doing, I think offers a very interesting angle that I think would be a real net win for NATO and frankly for Eurasia.
Tom, let me ask you this. I think it was probably last September, August, September, at the start of the final stretch in the US presidential race. I was reading Donald Trump suggesting, or his allies, his friends suggesting, that he may actually pull out of NATO if he got a second term. Well, of course, he hasn't done, and therefore he's unable to do so. But do you think he would have done, or was that just bluff?
No, I think that at the end of the day, that was really more bluff and bluster. I don't think he would have pursued that, largely because of the defense establishment in the United States. I think would have pushed back strongly, as it had to do many times when he announced extreme policies like that. Again, as we talked about earlier, I think that was probably largely an effort to get NATO to spend more, and also to put the United States at the center of the conversation, which is what Trump always did in any policy discussion, anything that he did, because by extension, putting the U.S. at the center of the discussion meant putting himself at the center of the discussion. And that's probably the most significant difference that we will see in the Biden administration going forward, who's really looking at the national interests of the United States and its allies, and not just the interests of the person occupying the White House.
It's been mentioned, Jamie, that Donald Trump wasn't the first president and probably won't be the last president to think that Europe hasn't been pulling its weight financially. But when we look at the current situation and where NATO goes with its approach to Joe Biden, or Joe Biden's approach towards NATO, will it actually be stronger now than perhaps it has been for some time?
Well, I think there's a short-term honeymoon, but of course you need to use honeymoons productively before they disappear. I think the worst mistake that the Europeans could make is to say, now Biden is there. He said we'll be back, and he kept his word. We're back in 2016. The Trump 4 years never happened. It was a bad dream, and we're just picking up with the NATO comfortably under American leadership that we had before. That would be a big mistake. Biden was not elected to solve the problems of Europe. He was elected first and foremost to solve the massive problems that the United States has on the home front, obviously, and he'll be judged on that, not on NATO, when he hopefully stands again or for election in 4 years' time. He's also clearly shown that he wants to keep Trump's strategic shift towards the Asia-Pacific. America can't do everything, so I think what the Europeans have to do is to benefit from the fact that they have a US leader who's more favorable to them, but use this honeymoon to move in a direction I think the President Macron has called on, which is to take more responsibility. Trump was successful in the United States because his message resonated with 70 million odd Americans that the Europeans were not sharing the burden fairly. The Americans didn't like the fact that they had to intervene in Libya. The Europeans couldn't do it by themselves. They like the idea that the Europeans are going to do more for their collective defense, particularly given, of course, the Europe's economic power. So I think that what we
Jamie,
need to do
just a quick final thought. I'm sorry to have to butt in, but we're coming near the end of the time.
To recognise that some of the problems are more fundamental and to have that greater European contribution, but not to simply sit back and think the good old days have returned. Excuse me.
Quick answer, if you would, to this one, because we're running out of time. If come the next US election, it is Trump versus Biden once again, what will Europe be thinking when it comes to defence and NATO?
Well, first of all, you would hope, I think, for a pro-NATO person, but like any good person, you'd have your insurance policy well and truly in place, effective and fully paid up for a rainy day.
Listen, thank you very much indeed to each and every one of you. Jamie, Shea, Rafaello Pantucci and Tom Sutton, thank you very much indeed from four corners of the globe. We welcome your contribution. Fascinating discussion. Hope to have you back on another time. From me, David Foster, from the team that put this roundtable together, we also hope to have your company on another occasion. But for now, goodbye.